The late afternoon sun hammered down on the Fredericksburg Country Club like divine judgment, turning the white colonial facade into a blinding monument to old Texas money. Margaret Hayes stepped out of her red BMW convertible with the practiced grace of someone who knew every eye would be on her. At 38, she was a vision of calculated perfection. The white Versace dress clung to her tanned body like a second skin. $50,000 worth of South African diamonds glittered at her throat, and her Louboutin heels clicked against the pavement with the confident rhythm of someone who believed she had already won. Dr. Richard Thornton emerged from the driver's side, adjusting his Italian suit jacket, his hand immediately finding the small of Margaret's back, with proprietary certainty. They paused at the entrance, framed by the doorway, knowing that inside the elite of Gillespie County were gathered, knowing that their entrance would be noted, measured, and envied. Margaret scanned the building with predatory satisfaction. This was her hunting ground. For 15 years, she had walked these halls as the wife of James Hayes, successful rancher, respected businessman, pillar of the community. But that role had ended 6 months ago when James lost everything, when his cattle empire crumbled, when his investments evaporated, when the bank foreclosed on the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations, when he became nothing, and Margaret, recognizing a sinking ship when she saw one, had jumped. 2 weeks after James moved into a dingy apartment above Billy Thompson's hardware store, Margaret was already in Richard's bed, already planning her escape from mediocrity, already constructing the narrative that would justify her abandonment. She had made the rational choice, the smart choice, the only choice any sensible woman would make, and now she was back, transformed, upgraded, ready to demonstrate to everyone exactly how right she had been. The doors opened before them, and the grand ballroom revealed itself in all its ostentatious glory. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, throwing soft prismatic light across cream-colored walls adorned with oil paintings of Texas landscapes and long-dead ranching patriarchs. The marble floor gleamed like still water, reflecting the well-heeled crowd that moved across it with the unconscious assurance of people who had never questioned their place at the top of the social hierarchy. Women in designer dresses clustered in tight groups, their laughter controlled, and their jewelry substantial. Men in expensive suits stood with thumbs hooked in pockets, discussing cattle prices and oil futures and the politics that affected both. This was the cream of Fredericksburg society, the people who mattered, the ones whose opinions could make or break reputations. As Margaret and Richard entered, the effect was immediate and gratifying. Conversations didn't exactly stop, that would have been too obvious, but they certainly paused, stuttered, shifted in tone and volume. Heads turned with varying degrees of subtlety. Eyes tracked their progress with the hungry interest of people who loved nothing more than witnessing social drama unfold in real time. Margaret stood taller, her spine straightening, her chin lifting just slightly, breathing in the attention like pure oxygen. This was what she had come for. This moment of collective acknowledgement, that she had not just survived her divorce from James Hayes, but had thrived, had upgraded, had proven that she was the kind of woman who always landed on her feet and always landed somewhere better than where she started. She made a deliberate show of admiring the decor, her voice pitched to carry to the nearby clusters of guests. "Richard, darling, isn't the ambiance just exquisite? Though I suppose anything looks sophisticated when one is accustomed to the best." She let her gaze sweep across the room with theatrical appreciation, making sure everyone could see her designer dress, her diamonds, her handsome wealthy doctor, the entire package of her apparent triumph. Richard played his part perfectly, murmuring agreement and pulling her closer in a display of possession that Margaret knew would be noted and discussed. But Margaret wasn't looking at the decor or the crowd. Her eyes were hunting, scanning the room with predatory focus, seeking the one person who mattered, the reason she had insisted on attending this particular event, despite Richard's initial reluctance to return to what he called this provincial backwater. And then she found him. James Hayes stood near the far wall in a cheap black server's vest that looked like it had been pulled from a box of rental uniforms, holding a silver tray laden with canapes, offering appetizers to people who 6 months ago would have been shaking his hand and discussing business deals. The man who had once commanded a $12 million cattle empire, who had owned 20,000 acres of prime Texas rangeland, who had been respected and admired throughout the county, now served food to his former peers for what Margaret knew was $15 an hour, plus the humiliation of existing in a space where he no longer belonged. The sight hit Margaret with such intense satisfaction that she had to suppress a visible shudder of pleasure. This was everything she had wanted to see, everything she had dreamed about during the 3 months since she had walked out of their marriage. The mighty brought low, the man who had failed her reduced to his proper station as a servant, a nobody, a cautionary tale. This was proof, tangible and public, that she had made the right choice, that her instincts had been correct, that staying with James would have dragged her down into this same humiliation. She could have been standing next to him in some second-hand dress, offering canapes to people who pitied them both. Instead, she was here, diamonds at her throat, a successful doctor's hand on her waist, living proof that some people were simply smarter and better at the game of life than others. She turned to Richard, her voice breathy with barely contained excitement that was almost sexual in its intensity. "Richard, darling, do you see that? Over there by the wall. That's him. That's James. My pathetic ex-husband. Actually working here, serving drinks and finger food. Can you believe it?" Richard followed her gaze and understood immediately what she wanted, what she needed. His smile turned cruel and amused. "Shall we go say hello?" he asked, knowing the answer before she gave it. Margaret nodded, already moving, her heels marking time on the marble floor like a countdown to execution, each step deliberate and measured, giving James time to see them approach, time to understand what was coming, time to feel the dread build, but no time at all to escape. Margaret walked slowly, savoring every second of the approach. She could see the exact moment James registered who was coming toward him. His shoulders tensed as if bracing for a physical blow. His knuckles whitened on the tray he was holding, gripping it so hard she thought for a moment it might bend. Something flickered across his face, an expression that might have been pain or resignation, or perhaps just exhausted acceptance of the inevitable. But to his credit, or perhaps to his pathetic inability to stand up for himself, he didn't turn and run. He didn't set down the tray and walk away. He just stood there and waited for the blow he must have known was coming, must have been dreading, since the moment he saw them enter the room. Richard reached James first, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that wealthy men reserve for service workers they consider beneath their notice, that studied dismissiveness that reminds the server of their place in the social hierarchy. "Waiter," Richard said, as if James were just another anonymous face in a vest rather than a man he had met multiple times at social functions back when James still had money and status. "2 glasses of your best champagne? And be quick about it, yes? My fiancé and I are quite thirsty." The word fiancé was delivered with surgical precision. A verbal knife slipped between the ribs, designed to wound, and Margaret watched with savage satisfaction as James's eyes dropped involuntarily to her left hand, where the 7-carat engagement ring caught the chandelier light and threw it back in brilliant flashes that seemed to illuminate the entire corner of the room. $120,000 on her finger. More money than James would earn in 5 years of serving drinks and carrying trays and swallowing his pride along with his failure. James raised his eyes from the ring to Margaret's face, and for just a moment she thought she saw something there. Something that wasn't quite defeat, something that flickered behind his blue eyes and then disappeared before she could identify it. His voice when he spoke was surprisingly steady, no tremor of emotion, no crack of despair. "Of course, sir. Right away." He reached for 2 champagne flutes from his tray with hands that looked steady enough, professional even, and began to extend them. But Margaret wasn't about to let this moment pass so simply, wasn't going to allow him the dignity of a clean transaction without maximum humiliation. She reached out and took one of the glasses before James could properly hand it to Richard, her fingers deliberately brushing his in a gesture that managed to be both intimate and contemptuous. She held the glass up to the light as if inspecting it for flaws, her expression one of theatrical skepticism that she knew would play well to the audience that was definitely watching now, conversations around them having died away completely as people recognized the drama unfolding. "Is it clean?" she asked, her voice pitched to carry across the immediate area, ensuring that at least a dozen people could hear every word. "I mean, considering the standard of certain people here these days, one never knows what one might be drinking from." She let her gaze travel deliberately from the champagne glass to James's face, making absolutely certain that everyone understood exactly who she meant by certain people, exactly what kind of standards she was questioning. A muscle jumped in James's jaw, the only visible sign that her words had landed, that he was affected by this calculated cruelty. His throat worked as he swallowed whatever response he might have wanted to make, but he remained silent, and his silence only fueled Margaret's contempt, made her want to push harder, to break through that infuriating calm and find the hurt and humiliated man she knew must be underneath. She wanted him to fight back so she could destroy him more thoroughly. She wanted him to beg so she could refuse. She wanted some kind of reaction that would validate the viciousness she was about to unleash. Richard played along perfectly, the consummate straight man to Margaret's lead performance. "Margaret, darling, I'm quite certain the glassware here meets acceptable standards." But his eyes gleamed with cruel amusement, enjoying the show as much as she was, getting vicarious pleasure from watching her destroy this man who had once been her husband. Margaret sighed dramatically, a sound that managed to convey both reluctant acceptance and continued doubt. "Well, I suppose it will have to do, won't it? Though it is so strange, isn't it, James?" She said his name for the first time, letting it hang in the air like an accusation, like evidence of some crime he had committed simply by existing in her presence. Seeing how dramatically things have changed, how far some people have fallen in such a remarkably short time. 6 months ago you were on the other side of this room, weren't you? Standing over there with the guests, the real guests, drinking $1,000 champagne, discussing your investments and your ranch and your big plans for expansion, making deals, being someone who mattered. And now, well, now you're serving champagne to people like us, people who actually knew how to manage their lives. People who understood that success isn't just about inheritance and luck, but about intelligence and adaptability and knowing when to cut your losses and move on to better things. The crowd around them had stopped even pretending not to listen now. Conversations in a 15-foot radius had died away completely, replaced by an electric silence. The kind of attention that accompanies a car accident or a public proposal or any moment when private drama becomes public spectacle. A bubble of silence expanded around them as everyone strained to hear every word of this public execution, this social murder being committed in slow motion. Margaret was acutely aware of her audience and played to it with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years performing the role of perfect wife, perfect socialite, perfect specimen of Texas womanhood. She knew exactly how to modulate her voice, how to time her pauses, how to deliver maximum impact with minimum effort. "You know, James, I really should thank you. I mean that sincerely, because your spectacular failure, your complete inability to hold on to what 3 generations of your family built, your catastrophic loss of everything you had, it gave me the greatest gift I could have asked for. It showed me who you really are, underneath all that inherited wealth and borrowed confidence. It showed me that I had been right all along to keep my emotional distance, to never fully invest in someone so fundamentally weak. It freed me from a marriage that was suffocating me, from a life that was killing me by inches, from the prospect of growing old with someone who turned out to be exactly as inadequate as I had always secretly suspected. It led me to Richard, to a real man, to someone who actually knows how to navigate the world successfully. And most importantly, it proved beyond any shadow of doubt that I was absolutely right to leave you when I did, that I made the correct choice, that I am smart and you are stupid, and everyone here can now see the evidence of that truth with their own eyes. Do you know what Richard gave me last week? She continued, her free hand moving to touch the diamond necklace at her throat with a gesture that managed to be both casual and calculated, drawing every eye to the expensive jewelry. This, 15 carats of absolutely flawless South African diamonds, set in platinum actually, not white gold, platinum, set by a master jeweler in Houston whose waiting list is 2 years long, $55,000. He gave it to me just because he can, just because he appreciates having a real woman by his side, someone who matches his own level of success and sophistication. When was the last time you gave me anything besides excuses and empty promises, James? When was the last time you made me feel valued or appreciated or even noticed? When was the last time you gave me anything that proved I mattered to you more than your stupid cattle or your pointless land, or your pathetic attempts to prove you were as good a rancher as your father? James's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, almost broken, but still maintaining some core of dignity that Margaret found intensely frustrating. I gave you 15 years of my life, Margaret. I gave you loyalty, faithfulness, love. I gave you a home, a life, a purpose. I gave you everything I had, everything I was. I thought that mattered. I thought that meant something. His words hung in the air, and for just a second, Margaret felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been shame or regret, or the ghost of the girl she had been before she became this person. But she crushed that feeling immediately, pushed it down, refused to let it surface or affect her momentum. She laughed, and the sound was sharp and cruel, and utterly without warmth or humor, more like glass breaking than actual laughter. "A home you lost," she spat, her voice rising now, feeding on the attention, the power, the absolute certainty of her righteousness. "A life you destroyed. A purpose that turned out to be completely meaningless because you were too incompetent to maintain any of it. And as for love, well, love doesn't pay the bills, does it, James? Love doesn't buy Louboutin shoes. Love doesn't purchase tables at Uchi or reserve boxes at the opera. Love doesn't book suites at the Four Seasons or arrange first-class tickets to New York. Richard is taking me to New York next month. Did you know that? Of course you didn't know. Why would you? You're completely irrelevant to my life now, but I'll tell you anyway because I want you to understand exactly what you lost when you failed. We're seeing 3 Broadway shows, sleeping at the Plaza, shopping on Fifth Avenue, having dinner at 11 Madison Park, living the life that I always deserved and that you could never actually provide, despite all your pretensions of success. When was the last time we did anything like that? When was the last time you took me anywhere that didn't smell like livestock or involve your boring rancher friends and their even more boring wives? James's voice was barely audible when he answered, and Margaret had to strain to hear him. 2 years ago. Nashville. That music festival you said you wanted to attend. I thought we had a good time. I thought you enjoyed it. Margaret felt rage surge through her at his pathetic attempt to defend himself, to suggest that his meager offerings had been sufficient. Nashville, she exploded, her voice loud enough now that people across the entire ballroom were turning to look, conversations stopping at tables 50 feet away, everyone's attention drawn to this spectacular public destruction. We drove 7 hours in your disgusting old truck that smelled like hay and diesel. We stayed at a Motel 6 that had stains on the carpet and paper-thin walls where we could hear the couple next door having sex. We ate at chain restaurants. We watched country bands perform in bars that smelled like old beer and older regret, and the dreams of people who never made it. That's your idea of a vacation. That's your idea of treating me well. God, James, I was living in the 19th century with you. I was trapped in some nightmare version of Little House on the Prairie, while all my friends were traveling to Europe and staying at real hotels and eating at real restaurants and living actual 21st century lives. Her voice was rising and falling now with practiced drama, her gestures becoming broader, more theatrical, and she was aware on some level that she was putting on a show, that this was performance art, that she was creating a moment that would be talked about for months in Fredericksburg social circles. "Richard respects me," she declared, her hand finding Richard's arm and squeezing it as if drawing strength from his presence. "He introduces me to his friends as a real partner, as someone with valuable opinions and insights, not as a pretty decoration or a piece of furniture that looks nice at dinner parties. He values my intelligence. He asks my advice about investments and business decisions. He treats me like an equal. You treated me like a farm wife, James, like someone whose entire job was to smile and look pretty and not ask too many questions about the real decisions that men were making. Do you know how insulting that was? How degrading, how soul-crushing. I have a degree in business administration from Texas State University. Did you ever remember that? Did you ever once think that maybe I could contribute something to your business decisions? Did you ever ask my opinion about a single important matter? No. You just wanted me to organize your dinner parties and impress your business associates and pretend that I was fulfilled by planning the church bake sale and attending cattle auctions. I could have been something, James. I could have built something real. I could have had a career, a purpose, an identity beyond being Mrs. James Hayes. But instead, I spent 15 years managing your social calendar and pretending to care about cattle prices and beef futures and whether the rain was good for the grass. 15 years of my life wasted playing a role that I hated, performing in a show I never auditioned for, trapped in a life that was slowly killing everything interesting about me. "That's not fair," James began, his voice finally showing some emotion, some anger or hurt breaking through the calm facade. "We talked about you working. We discussed you starting a business. You said you wanted to focus on the home, on building our life together, on eventually raising children. I never stopped you from doing anything." Margaret cut him off with a sharp gesture, her hand slicing through the air like a blade. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Was it fair that you gambled away our entire future on bad investments? Was it fair that you trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong advice, followed your gut instead of doing actual research and due diligence? Was it fair that you lost everything your family built over 3 generations, everything your grandfather and father and uncles worked for? You destroyed it all in less than 2 years of catastrophically bad decisions. Was it fair that you expected me to go down with your sinking ship just because we said some words in a church 15 years ago? Just because we made promises that you clearly weren't capable of keeping?" The crowd around them had grown. People were no longer even attempting to maintain the fiction of other conversations or other interests. They had formed a rough circle, champagne glasses in hand, watching this brutal public dismantling of a man who had once been one of their own. Some faces showed sympathy for James, recognition that this was cruel and excessive and undeserved. But most showed a kind of fascinated horror, the same expression people wear when passing a car accident, unable to look away even as they know they should, drawn to the spectacle of someone else's suffering because it makes their own lives feel safer and more stable by comparison. Margaret fed on their attention like a vampire, drawing energy from their shock and judgment and vicarious participation in her cruelty. But Margaret was just getting started. She had spent 3 months planning this moment, rehearsing these words in her head during sleepless nights, imagining exactly how she would destroy James when she finally had the chance. And now, with an audience to witness her victory, with Richard beside her as proof that she had traded up, with James standing before her in a waiter's vest, holding a tray like the servant he had become, she was finally going to say everything she had been holding back, everything she had wanted to scream at him during their marriage, but had kept locked inside behind a facade of supportive wife. You want to know the worst part, James? The real tragedy that you're probably too dense to even understand. The worst part is that I faked it all, every single bit of it. I faked loving you. I faked caring when you came home tired from working the ranch, when you told me about your day, when you shared your dreams and plans and aspirations. I faked being interested in your stupid expansion ideas or your breeding programs or your market analysis. I faked enthusiasm when you talked about eventually passing the ranch down to our children I never actually wanted to have with you. I faked every orgasm we ever had together, and there weren't that many because you were mediocre in bed at best. I faked every tender moment, every whispered I love you in the dark, every supportive conversation when you were stressed or worried or uncertain. It was all performance, James, all acting. All a carefully maintained lie designed to keep you happy and generous and providing the lifestyle I required. And you were too stupid, too trusting, too pathetically naive to see through any of it. You actually believed I loved you. You actually thought our marriage was real. How embarrassingly gullible can one man be? The words hit James like physical blows. Margaret could see each sentence land, could see him flinch as if she were actually striking him with her fists. His face went white, the color draining from his skin like water from a broken glass. His hands began to tremble, subtle at first but increasingly visible. The tray he was holding started to shake, the glasses on it rattling slightly, and Margaret found herself hoping he would drop it, that there would be the dramatic crash of breaking glass to punctuate this moment. She wanted physical destruction to match the emotional carnage she was creating. 15 years, James whispered, and his voice was finally broken the way Margaret had wanted it to be from the beginning. 15 years, and you never loved me. Not even at the start, not even for a moment, not even once. Margaret felt a surge of triumph so intense it was almost orgasmic. She had done it. She had finally shattered him completely, had stripped away every last defense, and exposed the hurt and helpless man beneath. This was what she had come for. This was her victory. I loved your money, she said with surgical precision, each word chosen for maximum damage, delivered with perfect timing. I loved the house with its 6 bedrooms and pool and guest cottage. I loved the luxury SUV you bought me and replaced every 3 years. I loved the country club membership and the vacation home in Colorado. I loved being Margaret Hayes, wife of the successful rancher, member of the most exclusive social circles in the county, respected and admired and envied. I loved the status and the security and the lifestyle that your money provided. But you, the pathetic, sentimental man underneath all that wealth, the boring rancher who thought that hard work and loyalty and being a decent person was all that mattered in life? Never. Not for one single second. Not even on our wedding day when I was walking down that aisle in my expensive dress, thinking about how smart I was to lock down someone with your financial prospects. Not even on our honeymoon, when you were so tender and loving, and I was calculating how much the trip was costing and whether you'd be that generous throughout our marriage. Not even during the good years when your business was thriving and I was playing my role perfectly. Never. I never loved you, James. I barely even liked you most of the time. A tear rolled down James's face, cutting a visible track through the dust and heat on his skin, and Margaret felt something close to ecstasy at the sight. This was everything she had wanted. This was total victory. James Hayes, the man who had wasted 15 years of her life, finally understanding exactly how little he had ever meant to her, exactly how thoroughly he had been used and manipulated and lied to. She wanted to capture this moment, to preserve it somehow, to be able to replay it whenever she needed to remember that she had won, that she was the strong one, that she had made the right choices, and he had made all the wrong ones. "And look at you now," she continued, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, something quiet and poisonous that somehow felt more cruel than her shouting had been. A waiter, a nobody, a cautionary tale. Serving food to people who used to shake your hand and call you friend, people who now pity you, people who whisper about you when you're not around and probably even when you are, because they no longer care enough to hide their contempt. There goes James Hayes, they say. Remember him? He used to be somebody. He used to own the Hayes Ranch, used to be worth millions, used to matter. Now he's just a failure who lost everything. Now he's just a sad reminder of what happens when you're too incompetent to hold on to what you have, when you make terrible decisions and trust the wrong people and think that hard work and integrity are enough to succeed in a world that actually runs on intelligence and ruthlessness. That's what you've become, James. That's your legacy, not the successful ranch or the respected family name or any of the things your ancestors built. Just a cautionary tale. Just a punchline to jokes people tell at parties. Just a sad man in a waiter's vest serving drinks to people who used to be your equals. And you know what the beautiful irony is? You did this to yourself. You made the bad investments. You trusted the wrong advisors. You lost everything through your own incompetence. And then you had the audacity to expect me to stay. To stick with you through your failure, to sacrifice my own future for your mistakes. Well, I'm not that kind of fool, James. I'm not the kind of woman who goes down with the ship just because some archaic notion of marriage vows says I should. I'm a survivor. I'm smart. I'm practical. And I made the right choice when I left you, and everyone here knows it. Richard finally intervened, putting a hand on Margaret's arm in a gesture that could have been restraining, but seemed more like gentle encouragement to wrap up this particularly satisfying scene. "Margaret, darling, I think you've made your point quite eloquently. Perhaps we should circulate and let James get back to his work. People are waiting for their drinks." But there was no real reproof in Richard's voice, no genuine attempt to stop her. He was enjoying this as much as she was, getting vicarious pleasure from watching her destroy this man who had once been her husband, proving his own superiority by association with her victory. Margaret shook off Richard's hand gently. "No," she said firmly, "it's not enough, because he needs to understand something. He needs to fully grasp the magnitude of what he lost and why he lost it." She turned back to James, who was staring at her with an expression that combined devastation with something else, something Margaret couldn't quite identify and didn't care enough to try. "He needs to understand that I don't feel even one microscopic ounce of guilt for leaving him, not one femtosecond of regret, not one molecule of doubt, because I made the right choice, the only choice. The choice that any rational, intelligent woman would make when faced with a husband who had just lost everything through his own stupidity. Look at me, James. Really look at me. See what I am now compared to what I was when I was trapped in that dying marriage with you. I'm more beautiful than I've ever been, happier, more fulfilled, more alive. Richard gives me everything you never could. Not just money, though God knows there's plenty of that, but excitement, sophistication, a life that actually matters. We're getting married next summer in Tuscany, did I mention that? A $2 million villa in the Chianti region, overlooking the vineyards and the rolling Tuscan hills. 200 guests flying in from all over the world. Catering by a Michelin-starred chef, music by a classical quartet, flowers shipped from Holland, a dress that costs more than you'll earn in the rest of your miserable, pathetic, wasted life. And we'll have our reception at a castello that dates back to the 14th century, drinking wine that costs $500 a bottle, celebrating the beginning of something beautiful while you're here in Fredericksburg, serving canapes for minimum wage, and going home alone to your depressing little apartment that smells like failure and regret. That's the difference between us, James. That's why I won and you lost. I'm smart enough to recognize when something isn't working and to get out before it drags me down. You're too sentimental, too attached to notions of loyalty and commitment that don't actually mean anything in the real world. I adapted, I survived, I thrived, you collapsed, you failed. You became exactly what you deserved to become, which is nothing. James wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of cocktail sauce across his cheek from a canapé he had been holding, the stain looking almost like dried blood. He looked like he had aged a decade in the past 10 minutes, his face haggard, his eyes hollow, his entire body seeming to cave in on itself under the weight of her words. He looked destroyed, annihilated, erased as a human being with dignity or worth. And Margaret loved it. She loved every second of it. She loved the power she felt, the vindication, the proof that she was stronger and smarter and better than him in every way that mattered. "I loved you," James said finally, his voice so low that Margaret almost didn't hear him over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "With everything I had, with everything I was, I loved you. I gave you everything, and it was never enough. It was never going to be enough. Because you're incapable of love, Margaret. You're incapable of seeing value in anything that doesn't have a price tag. You're incapable of loyalty or compassion or any of the things that make us human instead of monsters. I hope Richard makes you happy. I genuinely do, but I don't think he will. Because nothing will ever make you happy. No amount of money, no level of status, no size of diamond. You'll always want more. You'll always feel empty. And you'll always be running from that emptiness, buying things and finding new men and upgrading your life, but never actually fixing what's broken inside you." Margaret felt a flash of rage at his presumption, at his attempt to psychoanalyze her, to suggest that she was the one with problems when he was standing there in a waiter's vest, having lost everything. "And that," she said, her voice cold and final, "was your first mistake. Thinking love was enough. Thinking that being a decent person mattered more than being successful. Thinking that I would stay with a failure out of some romantic notion of standing by your man. Love means nothing in this world, James. Money means everything. Power means everything. Status means everything, and you have none of it. You're nothing. You never were anything except the money you inherited. And now that it's gone, now that you've proven you couldn't even hold on to what was given to you, everyone can see that there's nothing underneath. You're empty, you're worthless, you're a void in a waiter's vest, and I'm free of you, and that's the best thing that ever happened to me." She turned to leave, her point made, her victory complete, her public destruction of James Hayes witnessed by everyone who mattered in Fredericksburg society. But then she stopped, as if remembering something, as if struck by one final inspired cruelty. She opened her Louis Vuitton purse, the butter-soft leather costing more than a month of James's wages, and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She held it up so everyone could see it, making sure the gesture was visible and unmistakable, then let it flutter to the floor, where it landed among the scattered canapes from the tray James had been holding, settling into a puddle of cocktail sauce like a small green boat on a red sea. "For the tip," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "You'll need it. After all, I'm quite certain that $15 an hour barely covers rent on that depressing little hole where you're living now. Maybe if you save up, you can afford to buy yourself something nice, maybe a new shirt without stains, maybe a meal that isn't ramen noodles or whatever other poverty food you're eating these days. Maybe even therapy to deal with the trauma of having been married to someone so far above your station that you never should have aimed that high in the first place." Then she walked away, Richard at her side, her head high and her posture perfect, leaving James Hayes standing there in the middle of his public humiliation, surrounded by scattered canapes and spilled champagne, and the $100 bill that somehow seemed more insulting than generous, more contemptuous than kind. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her back, could sense the shock and horror and grudging admiration from people who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. She had done something spectacular and terrible, something that would be talked about for months, maybe years. She had destroyed a man in public and done it so thoroughly that there was no coming back from it, no recovering, no possibility of redemption. She felt invincible, powerful, justified, righteous. She had won completely and utterly, and everyone had seen it, and James had been exposed as the failure she had always known he was underneath his inherited wealth. This was the best moment of her life. This was triumph. She did not see the small smile that crossed James's face as he knelt to collect the scattered canapes, his hands moving with surprising steadiness, considering what he had just endured. She did not see the way his shoulders, which had been slumped in apparent defeat, now straightened slightly as he worked. She did not see the look he exchanged with Chuck the bartender, a long, meaningful glance that contained something very much like satisfaction, like completion, like a plan successfully executed. She did not see any of this because she was too busy savoring her victory, too busy imagining how she would describe this moment to her friends in Austin, too busy celebrating her own cleverness and strength and superiority. She was too busy winning to notice that maybe, just maybe, the game she thought she had won was actually still being played, and that the final move had not yet been made. 3 weeks passed, and they were among the most satisfying weeks of Margaret's life. The story of her confrontation with James spread through Fredericksburg like wildfire through dry grass, growing and changing with each retelling, but always ending the same way, with Margaret triumphant and James humiliated beyond recovery. The details varied depending on who was telling it. Some versions had her throwing the money in James's face. Some had her spitting at him. Some had her slapping him. But all versions agreed on the essential facts, that Margaret Hayes had publicly and brutally destroyed her ex-husband, that she had revealed their marriage had been a lie, that she had walked away victorious while he stood there broken. She received calls from friends she hadn't spoken to in months, women from Austin and Houston and Dallas who had heard the story through various social networks and wanted to hear her version, wanted to congratulate her on her escape, wanted to assure her that they would have done exactly the same thing in her position. She spent those weeks in a state of almost constant euphoria, shopping at the expensive boutiques in Austin, where salespeople knew her name and style, planning her wedding to Richard in exquisite detail, meeting with wedding planners and caterers and florists who shared her vision of the perfect Tuscan celebration. She spent hours looking at venues online, messaging with the owner of the villa where they would hold the ceremony, selecting wines and menu options and floral arrangements. Richard was attentive in ways that James had never been, or at least in ways that Margaret preferred. He took her to expensive restaurants 3 or 4 times a week, always making sure they were seen at the right places by the right people, always making sure their presence was noted and their relationship was understood as a significant social coupling. He bought her gifts that went beyond the diamond necklace and engagement ring, designer handbags and shoes and clothes, a new wardrobe that reflected her upgraded status. He introduced her to his wealthy friends, doctors and lawyers and businessmen who moved in circles that James had never accessed, who talked about investments and opportunities and deals that sounded both exciting and vaguely illegal. Margaret felt like she was finally living the life she had always deserved, the life she had been denied during her 15 years of marriage to a man who thought that hard work and integrity were sufficient. The divorce paperwork was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in late September in the offices of Douglas Reeves, Austin's most expensive divorce attorney, whose hourly rate was $750 and whose client list read like a who's who of Texas wealth and power. Margaret sat at the conference table, signing her name on document after document, the stack of papers seeming endless, while Richard sat beside her with his hand possessively on her knee, a gesture that was both comforting and claiming. Douglas was explaining something about community property and the division of assets, but Margaret barely listened because there were no assets to divide. James had lost everything. The house was gone, foreclosed by the bank. The ranch was gone, sold to pay creditors. The vehicles were gone. The bank accounts were empty. There was literally nothing left to fight over, which made the whole process remarkably simple and quick. Douglas seemed almost disappointed by how straightforward everything was. His $750 per hour expertise barely required for what amounted to routine paperwork. Usually in these cases, he said, adjusting his expensive designer glasses that probably cost more than a month of James's rent, there's at least some dispute over personal property. Photographs from the wedding, furniture accumulated over the marriage, family heirlooms or sentimental items, but Mr. Hayes didn't ask for anything, not a single item. He just signed everything you requested and returned the documents within 48 hours of receiving them. It's quite unusual, actually. Most people, even when they have nothing left in terms of financial assets, still want to hold on to something, still want some physical reminder of what they had, still feel the need to contest something out of principle or emotion or just wounded pride. Margaret felt a flicker of unease at this information, a small, cold tendril of doubt that wound through her satisfaction. It wasn't like James to simply give up. Even when his business empire had been collapsing around him, even when the creditors were circling and the bank was foreclosing and everything was falling apart, he had fought to save pieces of it. He had tried to negotiate with lenders. He had attempted to preserve particular parcels of land. He had refused to simply surrender until the very end, when he had no choice. And now, faced with the final dissolution of their marriage, he just signed everything without a single question, without asking for even one photograph or memento. It didn't fit his pattern. It didn't match what she knew about him. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't identify exactly what, but Richard was laughing, squeezing her knee, making a joke about how James probably didn't have room in his tiny apartment above the hardware store for anything anyway. Had Margaret seen the place? Richard hadn't personally, but he had heard descriptions from people who had. One room barely bigger than a prison cell with a hot plate for cooking and a fold-out bed and a bathroom the size of a closet. The kind of place that people rented when they had no other options, when they were one step above homeless. What would James do with photo albums or furniture or any of the accumulated possessions of their marriage? Where would he put them? He was lucky to have space for his clothes and his basic necessities. Margaret pushed the unease aside and signed her name one final time on the last document, the pen moving across the expensive paper with a satisfying scratch. Margaret Ann Hayes, for the last time. The next time she signed something important, it would be Margaret Ann Thornton, and that thought pleased her immensely, felt like a final vindication of all her choices. She was erasing her past and creating a new identity, becoming someone better and richer and more successful than the woman who had wasted 15 years married to James Hayes. Douglas collected all the documents with the efficiency of someone who processed dozens of these divorces every month, putting them in an expensive leather folder embossed with his firm's name. "Congratulations," he said with professional warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're officially divorced. I'll file these with the courthouse this afternoon, and in 30 days the divorce will be final and you'll be free to remarry. You're free to move on with your life, to start the next chapter, to put all of this behind you. Free." Margaret liked that word, rolled it around in her mind like a piece of candy. Free from James, free from the ranch, free from the expectations and limitations of being a rancher's wife, free to become whoever she wanted to be, with Richard's money and status to support her transformation. She stood up and smoothed her dress and let Richard pull her into an embrace. He kissed her neck, whispering that she was all his now, that nothing could come between them, that they were going to build something incredible together. Margaret leaned into him, feeling a sense of completion, of one chapter ending and a better one beginning. They left the law office and stepped into the brutal September heat of Austin, the temperature still in the mid-90s even though it was almost October, the air thick and heavy like a wet blanket. Richard's black Porsche Cayenne was parked right in front, in a spot that probably cost $50 an hour, gleaming in the sun like a predatory animal, beautiful and expensive and powerful. He opened the passenger door for her with a gallant gesture, and she slid into the leather seat that was already cool from the air conditioning he had left running, breathing in the smell of luxury and success and money well spent. Richard got in beside her and started the engine, and the car roared to life with a satisfying growl that spoke of German engineering and unnecessary horsepower. "Where would you like to celebrate?" Richard asked, pulling smoothly into traffic, one hand on the wheel and the other finding her thigh. "Uchi, their tasting menu is supposed to be exceptional this month. Or Justine's. Or we could drive down to San Antonio and hit that steakhouse you loved, the one where we had the Wagyu that melted in your mouth. Money is no object today. This is a special occasion. The end of your old life and the beginning of our life together." Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages and missed calls, feeling the satisfying weight of being wanted and needed and in demand. "Actually," she said, "I need to stop in Fredericksburg first. I have some things I left at Sarah Thompson's house when I was staying there during the separation. She said I could pick them up today. Clothes and jewelry and some books. I should collect them before we get too settled in Austin." Richard frowned, his good mood clearly dampened by this suggestion, his hand tightening slightly on the steering wheel in a gesture that might have been irritation. "Fredericksburg? Really? Margaret, that's going to take up the whole afternoon. That's 2 hours of driving for what? Some old clothes you probably don't even want anymore. Can't Sarah just ship them to you?" Margaret touched his arm with the gentle persistence that usually got her what she wanted. "It's on the way home anyway," she said reasonably. "Highway 290 goes right through Fredericksburg. It's barely a detour, and Sarah is one of my best friends. I need to maintain those connections, Richard. You know how this world works. Social networks matter. Relationships matter. I can't just disappear from Fredericksburg entirely. I need to keep one foot in that world, even as we build our life in Austin." Richard sighed but agreed, the sigh carrying just enough put-upon martyrdom to make it clear he was doing her a favor, that she should be grateful for his flexibility. "Fine," he said, "but we make it quick. I don't want to spend any more time in that town than absolutely necessary. The whole place smells like cattle and failure and small-town desperation. Every time I'm there, I feel like I need a shower afterward just to wash off the provincialism." He turned the Porsche toward Highway 290, toward Fredericksburg, toward the small town that had been Margaret's home for 15 years and that she had been so desperate to escape. They drove in silence for a while, the Texas landscape rolling past in its late summer colors of brown and gold and dusty green, the hill country gradually revealing itself in the gentle rises and falls of the terrain. Margaret watched out the window, lost in thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. Richard was right. She had won. She had escaped a failing marriage and found something better. She had made all the right choices. So why was there a small voice in the back of her mind suggesting that something wasn't quite right? Why did she feel unsettled instead of purely triumphant? What detail was nagging at her that she couldn't identify? Her phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet of the car. Sarah Thompson's name appearing on the screen. Margaret answered, expecting to confirm their arrival time, to tell Sarah they would be there in about an hour, to make sure her friend would be home. But Sarah's voice when she spoke was strange, tight with some emotion Margaret couldn't identify. Tension or excitement or fear, or maybe all three at once. "Margaret," Sarah said, her words coming fast, almost stumbling over each other. Have you seen the news? Have you been online? Have you turned on a radio? Margaret felt her stomach clench involuntarily, some primal instinct recognizing danger before her conscious mind caught up. What news? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm even as her heart started to pound. What are you talking about? About James, Sarah said, and Margaret's world tilted slightly, everything suddenly off balance. What about James? What happened? Is he okay? Did something happen to him? A flash of unwanted concern, an echo of 15 years of being his wife, of caring about his well-being even if she hadn't loved him the way he deserved. Turn on the radio, Sarah said, her voice urgent. Any station. It's on all of them. Local, national, probably international by now. It's everywhere, Margaret. Everyone is talking about it. Everyone knows. With hands that had begun to tremble, Margaret reached for the radio dial. Richard glanced at her, concerned, asking what was wrong, but Margaret couldn't answer. She found a news station, and the announcer's voice filled the car, professional and excited in that particular way that news people get when they're covering a really good story, something with all the elements of drama and surprise and human interest. In stunning developments announced this morning, the announcer was saying James Hayes, the rancher from Gillespie County who became somewhat famous 6 months ago for his apparent catastrophic bankruptcy, has revealed that the entire financial collapse was an elaborate and carefully orchestrated maneuver. Sources close to Mr. Hayes confirmed that he secretly reacquired his own property through a complex network of shell companies and limited liability corporations, effectively deceiving creditors, potential buyers, and apparently even his own wife. But that's not all, folks. In what might be the business deal of the decade for this region, Hayes has also announced today that he has finalized a $38 million land sale agreement with Apex Energy Corporation for exclusive oil and gas drilling rights on his property. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe, like someone had punched her in the stomach, like the air had been sucked out of the car. She stared at the radio as if she could make it stop talking. Make it take back what it was saying. Make this not be real. The announcer continued, clearly enjoying the story, milking it for every ounce of drama. Recent geological surveys conducted over the past 18 months indicate significant shale oil and natural gas deposits beneath the Hayes Ranch properties, potentially valued at hundreds of millions of dollars when fully developed. Industry experts we've spoken with suggest that Mr. Hayes, who many wrote off as a failed rancher just 6 months ago, may now be one of the wealthiest landowners in Texas. The Apex Energy deal alone, at $38 million, would make him a very rich man. But the long-term value of the mineral rights could be 10 times that amount or more. The announcer paused for effect, and Margaret wanted to scream at the radio, wanted to throw it out the window, wanted to make this stop. But the maneuver was not just about business, the announcer continued. In a statement released this morning through his attorney, Mr. Hayes said, and I quote, "The maneuver was necessary to expose certain people in my life who I suspected were more interested in my wealth than in my actual well-being. In particular, I want to address my recently dissolved marriage. Sometimes you need to lose everything or appear to lose everything to discover who really cares about you and who is just there for what you can provide. I'm grateful for the clarity this experience has given me. It was painful but necessary, and now I know the truth about relationships I once thought were genuine." The announcer wrapped up with barely contained glee. Mr. Hayes declined to give interviews, but confirmed through his representatives that he is now actively expanding his operations and is among the wealthiest ranchers in the state. As for his ex-wife, Margaret Hayes, who apparently left him shortly after his apparent bankruptcy, we've been unable to reach her for comment. But I think it's safe to say this might be one of the most expensive divorces in Texas history, from her perspective anyway. That's going to sting, folks. That is really going to sting. Margaret couldn't breathe. The world was spinning. She looked at Richard, whose face had gone completely white, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had turned white. "No," she whispered. "No, no, 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 no. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. It's not real. It's some kind of mistake, some kind of sick joke. Stop the car!" she suddenly screamed, her voice loud enough to make Richard jump. "Stop the car right now!" Richard slammed on the brakes instinctively, the Porsche skidding slightly as he pulled onto the shoulder of Highway 290, gravel crunching under the expensive tires. Margaret fumbled with the door handle, barely getting it open before she stumbled out onto the roadside, her designer heels sinking into the loose gravel, and vomited violently onto the ground. She heaved again and again, her stomach rebelling against the truth that was crashing down on her in waves, each wave bigger and more devastating than the last. It had all been a test, every bit of it. The bankruptcy, the foreclosure, the poverty, the humiliation of James serving drinks at the country club. All of it had been orchestrated, all of it had been planned. James had never lost anything. He had just hidden it, moved it around, made it look like he was broke when he was actually positioning himself for the biggest deal of his life. And Margaret had failed the test. She had failed it so completely, so spectacularly, so publicly, that there was no possibility of redemption, no way to spin it, no excuse that would make it better. "He played me." She gasped between waves of nausea, her throat burning, her eyes streaming. "That son of a bitch played me like a violin, and I never saw it coming." Richard was beside her now, his hand on her back, but his touch less comforting than it had been an hour ago, more tentative, more uncertain. "Margaret?" He tried to say something soothing, but she could hear the doubt in his voice, could sense him already pulling away emotionally, already recalculating whether being engaged to the woman who had just been exposed as a gold digger on Texas radio was good for his image and his practice and his standing in Austin society. "But I didn't know," Margaret said, hating how weak and desperate her voice sounded. "How could I have known? Nobody could have known. It was a perfect deception. He lied to everyone. The bank thought he was broke. The creditors thought he was broke. Everyone thought he was broke. How was I supposed to see through it?" Richard's voice was careful, distant, already creating emotional space between them. "That's not going to matter, Margaret. People don't care about nuance. They don't care about whether it was reasonable for you to believe what you believed. They care about the story. And the story here is crystal clear. You failed the test. When things got hard, you ran. When your husband lost everything, or appeared to lose everything, you left him for a richer man within 2 weeks. That's what everyone is going to remember. That's what they're going to talk about. You're going to be famous for all the wrong reasons. You're going to be the woman who chose money over love, the gold digger who got caught, the wife who abandoned her husband at his lowest point. People are going to crucify you. "You're thinking about leaving me," Margaret said, and it wasn't a question. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he had subtly moved away from her, in the calculation behind his careful words. Richard's jaw tightened, and he didn't deny it, which was answer enough. "I'm thinking about what this means for both of us," he said, his doctor's voice, the one he probably used to deliver bad diagnoses to patients. "This is going to be everywhere, Margaret. Every newspaper, every gossip column, every social media platform, every talk show. You're going to be a meme by tonight, a punchline, a cautionary tale. The woman who left her husband when he went broke, only to find out it was all a test and he's actually richer than ever. Do you understand what kind of coverage this is going to get? Do you understand how this is going to follow you for the rest of your life?" Margaret felt tears starting, hot and shameful, and she hated herself for crying, hated showing this weakness. "But I didn't know," she repeated uselessly. Richard started walking back to the car. "That's not going to matter," he said over his shoulder. "Get in. We need to figure out what to do." They sat in the Porsche on the side of Highway 290 with traffic rushing past them, and Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands. 53 notifications, text messages, missed calls, social media alerts, emails, all of them from the past 30 minutes, all of them probably about the news. Everyone wanted to talk to her, wanted to hear her side, wanted to watch her squirm. She started opening them, unable to stop herself even though she knew it would only make things worse, masochistically needing to see what people were saying about her. The messages from friends were careful, tentative, already distancing themselves. "Margaret, just heard about James. Hope you're okay. Call me if you need anything." And translation: "I'm acknowledging this happened, but don't actually call me because I don't want to be associated with you." Wow, Margaret, this is crazy. Didn't see that coming. Translation: "How could you have been so stupid? Margaret, people are talking. You might want to get ahead of this." Translation: "You're fucked and everyone knows it, but the social media was worse. So much worse." The story had exploded in the past hour, spreading like wildfire, and people were weighing in with opinions both harsh and creative. There were memes already, cartoon versions of Margaret with dollar signs for eyes. There were think pieces being written in real time about loyalty and materialism and what this said about modern relationships. There were comments from strangers who felt entitled to judge her, to tell her exactly what they thought of women like her, to condemn her with the righteous fury of people who had never faced any real moral test themselves. She deserves everything she gets. She abandoned her husband when he needed her most. This is what happens to gold diggers. Karma is real. Imagine being so shallow you can't see past someone's bank account to who they really are. I hope she's happy with her doctor now that the whole world knows what kind of person she is. James Hayes is a genius. He exposed her perfectly. She literally told him at a country club that she never loved him. What kind of monster does that? I bet the doctor dumps her now that she's toxic. Who wants to be associated with that? And these were just the comments from strangers. The people she actually knew were being more subtle, but just as damning. Sarah's Facebook post from 10 minutes ago just goes to show you never really know someone. Sometimes the people you think are your friends turn out to be something very different. Choose your associations wisely. Deborah Chen, who Margaret had known since college. Loyalty matters, character matters, money isn't everything, some lessons are expensive. Even people from Austin, people she had met through Richard, were subtly changing their relationship status with her. Unliking old posts, removing tags from photos, creating distance in that passive-aggressive way that social media enabled. Margaret's phone rang. Unknown number, but a Dallas area code. She almost didn't answer, but some masochistic impulse made her pick up. The voice on the other end was male, professional, identifying himself as a producer for Wake Up Dallas, the city's highest-rated morning show. They wanted to interview her, he said, his tone suggesting he was offering her a wonderful opportunity rather than a chance to be publicly eviscerated. They wanted to hear her side of the story. They wanted to give her a platform to explain herself. They would pay her, of course. $20,000 for a 1-hour interview. All she had to do was sit down with their hosts and answer some questions about her marriage, her decision to leave James, her relationship with Richard, and how she felt now knowing that it had all been a test she had failed. Margaret's first instinct was to say yes, to take the money, to get something out of this disaster. $20,000 was $20,000, and given that Richard was clearly about to dump her and she had no job and no prospects, money was going to matter very soon. But then she imagined it. Sitting under harsh studio lights, 2 perky morning show hosts asking pointed questions with fake sympathy. "So, Margaret, when exactly did you decide to leave your husband? Was it the day after the foreclosure or before?" Can you help us understand how someone stays married for 15 years to someone they claim to have never loved? What would you say to people who are calling you the worst wife in America? The audience would be there to judge her. The viewers at home would be hate-watching. Every word she said would be dissected and mocked. It would be torture, and she would be getting paid to torture herself. She hung up without responding. The phone rang again immediately. Another producer, another show, this one offering $30,000. Then another call, then another. They were circling like vultures, smelling blood, wanting to pick her corpse clean. Her humiliation had become a commodity, something to be bought and sold, packaged and presented for entertainment. She turned off her phone, unable to take any more. "We have to go back," Margaret said suddenly, turning to Richard. "Back where?" he asked warily. "To Fredericksburg, to James. I have to talk to him, I have to explain, I have to try to fix this somehow." Richard actually laughed, a short, bitter bark of sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "Explain what, Margaret? Explain that you're sorry. Explain that you didn't mean all those things you said at the country club 3 weeks ago. You think he's going to believe that. You think anyone is going to believe that. You showed everyone who you really are. You told James, in front of dozens of witnesses, that you never loved him, that your entire marriage was a lie, that you only cared about his money. There's no taking that back. There's no explaining it away. You can't unring that bell. But maybe I can apologize," Margaret said desperately, grasping at possibilities. "Maybe I can tell him I was wrong, that I let fear and insecurity drive my decisions, that I made a terrible mistake. Maybe he'll understand. Maybe he'll forgive me. Maybe we can start over." But even as she said it, she knew how ridiculous it sounded. She had destroyed James publicly and cruelly. She had told him his marriage was a lie. She had humiliated him in front of everyone who mattered. There was no coming back from that. No apology that could erase those words or heal that wound. Richard's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, delivering a verdict rather than an opinion. "He's not going to take you back, Margaret. Why would he? He just proved that you're exactly what he suspected you were. A woman who only cared about money. A woman who would abandon her husband the second things got hard. A woman who was willing to humiliate him publicly just to make herself feel powerful. He doesn't need you. He doesn't want you. And honestly, neither do I." Margaret turned to stare at him, her mouth falling open in shock, even though part of her had known this was coming, had seen it building in every careful word and uncertain touch. "What?" Richard wouldn't look at her, just stared straight ahead through the windshield at the traffic rushing past. "I said neither do I. I'm not going to marry someone who's about to become the most hated woman in Texas. I have a reputation to protect, Margaret. A medical practice to maintain. Wealthy patients who expect a certain standard from their doctor. I can't afford to be associated with this kind of scandal. I can't have my name attached to yours when you're being torn apart in the media. I'm sorry, but this isn't what I signed up for." "You're breaking up with me," Margaret said, the words coming out flat and stunned and somehow still not quite believing, even as she heard them. "Right now, on the side of the highway, while I'm having a complete breakdown, while my life is falling apart." Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he finally turned to look at her, his expression somewhere between pity and contempt. "I'm being practical," he said. "Something you should have been 6 months ago. If you had just stayed with your husband, if you had shown even a shred of loyalty or patience or human decency, you'd be a very wealthy woman right now. You'd be married to one of the richest men in Texas. Instead, you're about to be a divorced woman with no money, no job, no prospects, and a reputation that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. People are going to be teaching business ethics courses using your story as an example of what not to do. You're going to be a case study in failure, and I'm sorry, Margaret, but I didn't sign up for that. I can't be part of that. You need to get out. Get out, Margaret repeated stupidly. You want me to get out here? We're on the highway. We're 40 miles from anywhere. Richard reached across her and opened the passenger door, letting in the noise of traffic and the heat of the afternoon. You can call an Uber, he said, or a taxi. Or maybe one of your friends will come get you, though I wouldn't count on that last one. They're probably all reading about you on their phones right now. They're probably all trying to figure out how to distance themselves from you as quickly as possible. Social death happens fast, Margaret. You're about to learn that. Margaret found herself standing on the gravel shoulder of Highway 290, watching Richard's Porsche pull back into traffic and accelerate away, the engine roaring as he shifted through the gears, putting distance between himself and the woman who was about to become a national punchline. The sound faded into the general noise of traffic and wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She stood there for a long moment, her designer dress covered in dust from the roadside, her makeup running from tears and sweat, her $50,000 necklace suddenly feeling like a noose around her throat, heavy and constricting and suffocating. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and stared at the screen. 78 notifications now, growing even as she watched. Text messages and calls and social media alerts from people who wanted something from her, whether that was an interview or a statement or just the satisfaction of her public humiliation. She couldn't face any of it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She opened her Uber app and requested a ride, watching the little car icon search for drivers in the area. It took 5 minutes before someone accepted, a driver named Carlos, who was 23 minutes away. 23 minutes of standing on the side of the highway, watching traffic pass, feeling every eye on her, even though she knew rationally that most people in those cars had no idea who she was or what had happened to her. But it felt like the entire world was watching, judging, laughing at the gold digger who got caught, the wife who failed the test, the woman who chose wrong and was now paying the price. Carlos arrived in a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days, the interior smelling of fast food and air freshener, and the accumulated desperation of someone driving for Uber because they had no better options. He was a young Hispanic man who glanced at her in the rearview mirror with obvious recognition, his eyes going wide as he put together her face with the story that was probably all over his social media. "You're her," he said. "From the radio. The lady whose husband faked being poor." Margaret didn't have the energy to deny it. She nodded mutely. Carlos whistled low. "Damn. That's rough. Like really rough. Where you want to go?" "Motel 6 in Austin," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. "The one on I-35. Carlos raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised that the woman in the expensive dress with the diamond necklace wanted to go to a budget motel, but he didn't question it. He just put the address in his GPS and pulled back onto the highway. They drove in silence for several miles, Carlos occasionally glancing at her in the mirror with undisguised curiosity, probably wondering if he should say something comforting or just leave her alone. Finally, he spoke. "My abuela, my grandmother, she always says that the hardest tests in life are the ones we don't know we're taking, that God or the universe or whatever you believe in, it tests us when we think no one's watching. And that's when you find out who you really are, not who you pretend to be, not who you want people to think you are, who you really are deep down." Margaret closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her, finding no comfort in them, but recognizing their truth. Carlos continued, warming to his theme. "And she says that the good thing about failing a test is that you can always take it again. Maybe not the same test, maybe not with the same people, but life gives you chances to prove you've learned something, to show you've changed, to become someone better than you were." His words hung in the air between them, and Margaret wanted to believe them, wanted to think that redemption was possible, that she could somehow learn from this catastrophic failure and become someone different. But right now, Sitting in the back of this Uber that smelled like desperation while her phone buzzed with endless notifications and her life disintegrated around her, redemption felt impossible. Transformation felt impossible. Everything felt impossible except the crushing weight of what she had done and what she had lost. They arrived at the Motel 6 as the sun was setting, the cheap hotel looking exactly as depressing as Margaret expected. Carlos pulled up to the entrance and turned to look at her directly for the first time. "Hey," he said, and his voice was gentle. "I don't know you. I don't know your whole story. But I hope things get better. I hope you figure out whatever you need to figure out. Everyone deserves a second chance, you know, even people who mess up really bad." Margaret felt tears starting again and blinked them back. "Thank you," she managed. Carlos nodded and waited while she got out, watching to make sure she made it inside safely before driving away. The motel room was exactly what she expected, and somehow worse. Thin industrial carpet that had seen decades of foot traffic. Dated furniture that looked like it had been ordered from a catalogue in 1987 and never updated. A television bolted to the dresser as if someone might try to steal it. A bathroom that smelled of industrial cleanser, trying and failing to mask decades of accumulated desperation and transient humanity. This was where Margaret Hayes ended up. Not in a villa in Tuscany, not in a house in Westlake Hills, not in any of the places she had imagined herself living. But here, in a $60 a night motel room, alone and humiliated, and without any clear path forward. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself cry, really cry, deep wrenching sobs that shook her entire body and left her gasping for air. She cried for her marriage even though she had never really wanted it, even though she had used James for 15 years without loving him. She cried for the life she had just lost, the wedding plans and the Austin house, and the security she had thought she was building with Richard. She cried for her reputation, now destroyed beyond any hope of repair. She cried for the future she had been imagining, all of it evaporated like morning dew in the Texas heat. But most of all, she cried for herself, for the woman she had become, for the choices she had made, for the person she saw, reflected in all those cruel social media comments and news articles. She had become a villain in her own story, and she had done it to herself through a series of choices that had felt rational at the time, but now revealed her to be exactly as shallow and materialistic as everyone was saying she was. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because she woke to morning light filtering through thin curtains and her phone buzzing with relentless insistence. She had turned it back on at some point during the night without fully waking, some habitual gesture, and now it was making up for lost time. 147 notifications. The number kept climbing as she watched. The story had clearly spread overnight, probably gone national, or even international, becoming one of those viral human interest stories that people couldn't resist sharing and discussing and judging. One email in particular caught her attention. It was from Douglas Reeves, her divorce attorney, the subject line reading, "Urgent regarding Hayes divorce settlement." Margaret opened it with a sense of dread that was immediately justified. Douglas's language was formal and carefully neutral, lawyer speak designed to communicate bad news without actually sounding negative. In light of the revelations regarding Mr. Hayes's actual financial situation, the email began, "There may be grounds to revisit the divorce settlement. Texas law does allow for modification of divorce decrees in certain cases of fraud or material misrepresentation of assets. If Mr. Hayes deliberately misrepresented his financial situation during divorce proceedings, you may be entitled to a portion of his assets after all, possibly including a share of the Apex Energy proceeds." For just a moment, Margaret felt a flicker of hope, a small flame of possibility that maybe she could still salvage something from this disaster. Maybe she could get money from James, even if she couldn't get anything else. Maybe she could walk away with enough to rebuild her life, to start over somewhere new, to have at least the financial security she had thought she was securing by marrying him in the first place. But then she read the next paragraph, and the hope died as quickly as it had been born. However, Douglas continued, such a case would be extremely difficult to prove and unlikely to succeed. Mr. Hayes did not technically lie about his financial situation during the divorce proceedings. At the time the papers were filed and signed, he was genuinely bankrupt according to all available documentation and legal filings. The fact that he had orchestrated that bankruptcy through a complex series of legal maneuvers, and that he had planned to reverse it through the Apex Energy deal, does not constitute fraud in the legal sense, as he made no false statements under oath regarding his assets at the time. Moreover, pursuing such a case would require extensive legal resources with no guarantee of success, and would likely further damage your public reputation. The court of public opinion has already rendered its verdict, and attempting to claim money from a man you publicly stated you never loved would only reinforce the perception of you as opportunistic and mercenary. The email concluded with Douglas noting that he would be happy to discuss options if Margaret wished, but that his retainer would need to be paid in full before he could provide any additional services. Margaret checked her bank account and felt her stomach drop. $4,300. That was everything she had in the world. All her other accounts had been joint with Richard, and he had clearly already moved to cut off her access. The diamond necklace was worth $50,000, the engagement ring worth more than $100,000, but they belonged to Richard legally, and if she tried to keep them, he would have the police involved faster than she could blink. She was, for all practical purposes, broke. Not as broke as James had pretended to be, not sleeping on a friend's couch broke, but broke enough that her previous life was now completely out of reach.